Hey everyone, welcome back to the Forge of Sagas. I recently went to my local Renaissance fair, and every year my friend group and I dress up to a theme, usually picked out by my partner. And this year she decided that we were all going to be characters from A Midsummer Night's Dream because she wanted to dress up as Titania, Queen of the Fae. So that means, of course, I got the job of playing Oberon. Now, in years past, I've generally built my costumes off of just clothes and accessories. I don't make anything per se, but this year I decided to put in a little bit of extra effort, and I ended up crafting this arm. Honestly, I was really surprised with how well it turned out, and as you can imagine, a lot of people asked me how I made it. Luckily for them and all of you here on YouTube, I recorded the whole process. So without further ado, let's create the Arm of Oberon. To form the base of the arm, I decided to start with what I knew, 3D printing. This arm came out of a Full Metal Alchemist cosplay piece, and I will be using a bunch of 3D printed components throughout this build, so I will leave all the links to them in the video description below. Now, the reason I printed these separately is that I just don't have a printer big enough to print the whole thing in one piece, so to join the two halves together, I used this plastic welding gun. Basically just heats up the metal staple and then you can press it into the plastic and it creates a really tight bond. I decided to add in a whole lot of these just to make sure that this was never going to come apart again. Then I came in with my diagonal cutters and just snipped off the little tips. After my initial test fit, I realized that I was going to have to make some cuts. And I started off by cutting off everything below that black line, as everything below the line was starting to push into my neck. I started off using my Dremel, but that was taking a little too long, so I switched over to a hacksaw to get the job done a little bit more efficiently. I also came in and removed the interior lip with my jeweler saw. It just wasn't sitting against my body very comfortably, so it had to go. My misadventures in 3D printing continued with this armor plate. I liked how it added some bolt to the shoulder, but it didn't quite fit with my existing piece. Thankfully, PLA plastic is thermoreactive, so I heated it up with a heat gun and was able to get it to conform a little bit better onto the shoulder piece. However, there was no efficient way for me to use the plastic welding gun to attach the armor plate to the shoulder base, so instead I grabbed my drill press and drilled a hole for some bolts. Once I had the holes I needed drilled into the armor plate, I used that as a guide to drill the holes into the shoulder base using my drill. Once all the holes were drilled, I went in and added my bolts. Now the ones you see here were the ones I used in the initial test because that's what I had laying around, but they are obviously way too long. So I went to the hardware store and got ones that better fit. I also got some nylon threaded nuts, as they're going to hold a lot more tightly than just your standard nut. The last thing that I had to add to this shoulder piece was this leather suspender thing that I found on Amazon as a way to actually attach it to my body. Initially, I just attached it with a single screw and bolt, but after a little bit, the material tore through the bolt, and eventually I had to switch over to these 3 really big screws complete with washers, which in reality is probably what I should have done in the first place. Of course, the last thing I had to do was a little bit of a test fit, and overall I was pretty happy with how it turned out, so I started moving on to the rest of the arm. Next, I moved on to the bracer, which was also built on a 3D printed base. Once I had the pieces aligned the way I wanted them to, I just came in with some hot glue and fused them together. However, the one thing I didn't like about the way the bracer was shaped is the big gap between the wrist and the elbow, so I had to come in and add a little bit of EVA foam to help bridge that gap. To help fill in the gaps and smooth out all the transitions, I used some air dry foam clay. One thing with this is to make sure that you keep your fingers wet at all times, as it really helps the clay not stick to your fingers while you're trying to get it on the piece. However, after I did a test fit, I wasn't quite happy with how it looked around the elbow, so I came in and added another piece of EVA foam and then blended that together with the foam clay. Lastly, I needed some armor plates for my bicep, so I 3D printed 2 pieces from the Full Metal Alchemist set and then attached a little bit of Velcro to them. The other end of the Velcro was going to get attached to this compression sleeve, so in order to make sure it sat in the right spot, I took off the adhesive on the backing of the Velcro and then slapped it in place on my shoulder so that it would fit in the right spot. After I carefully peeled off the armor plates, I traced the outline of the Velcro, as its inbuilt adhesive just wasn't going to be strong enough. So instead I applied some E6000 glue, as I knew once I put that on, this thing was never going to come off again. Once that was all set, I applied a layer of EVA foam to the bicep plates, and then I started in on the detailing. The first step was to cut all of the edges in a jagged, haphazard way in order to give it a more natural bark feel. Here's a picture from this stage of the process, and as you can see, I applied a lot of EVA foam and foam clay across the entirety of the piece. But this is going to be really important for our next detailing step. I started off the next step by drawing in the major grooves in the bark with the silver Sharpie. There's no real rhyme or reason to where I draw the lines, it's just where I thought they looked good. Once all my lines were drawn, I went out into my garage and started cutting those lines in with the sanding bit of my Dremel. I also smoothed out the edges a little bit to give it a more natural texture. When you're doing this, make sure that you are wearing a mask and are in a well-ventilated environment, as you are going to create a lot of dust. Next, we're going to add some texture to our bark using some hot glue and parchment paper. You can also do this with wax paper, I think, as both shouldn't stick to the hot glue long term. Parchment paper is just what I had laying around. The goal here is to crinkle up the paper so that it has a similar texture to what you would see in bark on a tree. Once our paper is ready to go, we can apply hot glue to a small section of the armor so it doesn't cool off too fast, and then gently tap on our parchment paper as it will leave the imprint of the creases in the hot glue once we pull it off. It's really good to have all your pieces ready to go at this time so you can keep moving from piece to piece so that you can have a little bit more of an efficient assembly line style. Once the hot glue has cooled completely, you can come in and peel off the paper. Sometimes it sticks a little bit and you might tear it here and there, but I really like the texture that it gives at the end of the day, and I think this is a pretty efficient way of transforming the flat EVA foam into a really nicely textured bark lookalike. Next, we move on to the claw, which of course has been 3D printed, and you can find the link for it in the description. I then went to attach the claws to the glove, and here you can see me doing it the stupid way, which was applying hot glue very, very close to my fingers. And yes, I did end up burning my thumb when I went to do that part. Instead, what I should have done and what you should do is apply some super glue to the back of the knuckle bones. You can see there's that extended part, and that'll stick to your glove a lot more nicely, and it'll keep you from burning yourselves. So, lesson learned there. Now, I needed to have access to this wrist strap so I could get the glove on and off, but I didn't want to see it in the finished costume. So I grabbed some more Velcro and my E6000 adhesive, and I'm going to make a top plate to go over the hand to help hide that strap and better blend the hand into the rest of the arm. Then the glove basically got the same process as every other piece, and this is the finished product. Now, to make our armor look like that, I first applied a layer of Plastidip in order to make the hot glue paintable, and then I sprayed it with a layer of brown spray paint. Then I came in with a lighter brown and dry brushed that over all of the bark. I wanted the top layer to have a lighter texture, but I wanted to keep that nice deep brown in the recesses to help make the top layers really pop. While I basically went for about 80% coverage with the first dry brush, my goal for the second dry brush was about 50% coverage. I wanted some of the lighter tones to be evident in the armor, and I wanted a good blend, but I still wanted some of that original light brown. Then for the last highlight, I tried to get about 25% coverage with my dry brush, really picking out a couple of areas on the armor piece to have the brighter color, while leaving the rest with the darker shades to help create a little bit of variety. Now that everything was painted, it was time to move on to some greenery, and I started off with these leaves that I got at my local craft store. They're really easy to pluck off, so I just made sure that I took all of them off the stem so that I could mix and match however I needed. I started off with adding greenery around the edges of all the armor pieces to help hide any pieces of my actual arm that might stick out as I move in the costume. This also gave a nice little border to everything, and I really liked how it came together in the finished product. I also added some moss to a lot of the edges of the different armor pieces just to help with the overall transition, and in some places to add a little bit more comfort for myself. Of all the different armor pieces, the glove had the biggest gaps, and I decided that a creative way to solve the gaps on the top of the armor would be to give myself some floral rings. So I just used a little bit of hot glue to attach some flowers and leaves over these joints because the flowers would still bend once I moved the knuckles, but they would help hide the gap and make things look a little bit more natural. For the underside of the glove, I went with some Spanish moss. It's nice and stringy, it requires pretty minimal points of contact to glue on effectively, and it expands really nicely to fill the entire gap. I also did the same thing on the compression sleeve using some small dots of hot glue to attach some more Spanish moss, just to cover the space around my elbow. The rest of the armor was decorated with a mixture of moss, fake flowers from my local craft store, and these cute little butterflies that I found in the clearance section at my local Michael's. I also conducted a lot of mobility tests while I was doing the decorating, not only to get used to moving in the armor, but also to make sure that there were very few places, if any, where you could see my natural skin or the compression sleeve directly. Of course, the testing wasn't complete until I put on the entire costume and walked around my backyard for an hour to make sure that it wouldn't be too uncomfortable. And here we have the finished product. For my first attempt at a major cosplay piece, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. If you guys have any questions about the process or suggestions as to how I could improve it, please leave me a comment. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, like, share, subscribe, you know the YouTube drill. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again the next time we ignite the Forge of Sagas.